Four men. A fire. The kind of dark you only get when you're genuinely far from everything. They'd had a good day. And then one of them said something out loud. Just a wish. The kind you say without thinking. The others laughed. Nobody thought anything more of it. They should have. Welcome back to Golden Cattle Media. Tonight we're in the Scottish Highlands with a creature the Gaelic world has been whispering about for centuries. Something that looks like a woman, moves like nothing on two legs should, and has a very specific role for who it goes after. One man survived meeting her, 3 of his friends didn't. And the reason he survived is something he didn't even know he had. By the end, you'll understand why people still warn each other to this day not to say their wishes out loud in the dark. Let's go back to the night before. 4 men, a fire in the middle of the Scottish Highlands, mountains pressing out on every side, the dark coming fast, and the kind of silence you only get when you're genuinely far from everything. They'd been hunting all day, 3 deer between them, which is pretty successful. Tired, warm from the fire. By any measure, it was a good night. Alasdair remembers the exact moment it stopped being that. It was Ewan who'd said it. He'd had something to drink, they all had, and he said out loud what all 4 of them were probably thinking. I wish there were women here. The others laughed. What else do you do? You're 4 men, a long way from home, and someone says something a bit embarrassing. You laugh, you move on. Except in the Highlands, in the dark, a wish spoken out loud carries further than you think. The women came out of the tree line maybe an hour later. 4 of them beautiful. Improbably beautiful. Which, if you were thinking clearly, would have been the first warning sign. 4 stunning women appearing from nowhere in the middle of a Highland wilderness in the middle of the night. But you're not thinking clearly. You've been out in the cold since dawn. You're tired and warm, and you've had something to drink. In that state, the brain doesn't ask whether something makes sense, it just accepts the good thing. So they danced, all 8 of them, around the fire. Alasdair's partner was extraordinary. He couldn't look away from her. Which is exactly why it took him so long to notice that his friends had gone quiet. Not quiet like the conversation had died, quiet like they weren't there anymore. He looked past his partner's shoulder. Ewan was on the ground, not sleeping. Something went cold in Alasdair's chest. He stepped back. His partner's grip tightened on his arm, her fingers pressing in like a trap, and something in his body decided before his mind had the chance. He ran, straight for the horses. The women followed, faster than anything on 2 legs has any right to be. He could feel them behind him, the air shifting as they closed the gap. He threw himself onto his horse and rode, and they stopped, right at the edge of the camp. He looked back from the dark, and there they were, standing still, watching him, making no move to follow. He didn't understand why, not until daylight. His horse had been freshly shod the week before. New shoes, new iron, and whatever these women were, that was the thing they could not cross. The people of the Highlands had a name for what he'd survived. In Gaelic, they're called the Banshee. The second part of that name, she, you might recognize from another Scottish creature. The one that wails outside your door before someone in the family dies. The Banshee. The woman of the fairy mound. The she are the supernatural beings of the Gaelic world, the creatures of the in-between spaces, and they have been sharing this landscape of human beings for as long as the stories go back. The Banshee are something specific within that world. Not the helpful kind of fairy, not the mischievous kind, the kind that kills. They appear as women, always women, beautiful, usually dressed in white or green, the colors that Gaelic tradition associate with the other world. They're drawn to men, specifically to hunters, to men traveling in groups through the wild country, and above all, men who announce their desires out loud. That's not a detail, that's the mechanism. You ask for something you shouldn't have in a place where the asking is heard and something comes to answer it. And it comes as a group. Not one creature hunting 4 men at random, 1 creature per man. Paired, matched, chosen. That kind of precision doesn't belong to any random predator. What the tradition calls this is glamour. The fairy ability to appear as something other than what they are. The beauty isn't real, the warmth isn't real, the music isn't real. All of it is designed to get you comfortable, to get your guard down, to make you forget where you are and what the darkness outside the firelight might be holding. The first written record we have comes from 1935, when a folklorist named Donald MacKenzie collected the hunter's story in his book, Scottish Folklore and Folklife. Before that, this was entirely oral, passed in Gaelic, mouth to ear, through generations of Highland communities. The scholar Katharine Briggs, who spent her career cataloging British fairy traditions, also documented the Banshee and placed them within a specific corner of the fairy world. beautiful, deadly, and operating by rules. And here's where it gets genuinely strange. The Baobhan drain their victims. Blood, violence, death. This is not the kind of fairy that steals your butter or leads you off the path. This one murders you. But she's not a vampire, not in the way most people picture anyway. Not the Eastern European Bram Stoker, garlic and crucifix version. She's older and stranger than that. She's a fairy with predatory habits, which is honestly more unsettling because vampires can be stopped with a stake through the heart. The Baobhan is stopped with iron. Iron is the great repellent across most of Celtic tradition. Cold iron, iron that hasn't been heated or worked, is the strongest protection. A horseshoe, an iron nail in your pocket. The Highlanders who knew about the Baobhan carried iron, not as a weapon exactly, as a ward. So the wish gets you in trouble, and the iron gets you out of it. The folk tradition of the Scottish Highlands was full of warnings about careless speech. You do not boast, you do not invite, you do not say things out loud that you're not prepared to have answered. This is a landscape where the old folk are real and present and paying attention. Want something carelessly enough to say it out loud, and something will come to give it to you. The problem is, it won't stop there. So how do we actually explain a creature like this? There's the usual medical explanations, there always are, but there are two non-medical explanations that I think are actually far more interesting. They're the kind of explanations that really speak to what it's like to be human. Okay, so the medical explanation is a condition you might not have heard of before. Porphyria. It's a group of disorders that affect blood production, and in severe cases, it can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight and a craving for heme, the compound found in blood. Scholars have suggested that porphyria is a possible route for vampire folklore across Europe, and there's logic to it. A person showing those symptoms in a small medieval community would be terrifying and inexplicable. You would need a story for what they were. It's an interesting idea, but it doesn't fit the Baobhan, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a cop-out. She isn't a single figure, she's a type, a recurring creature, a pack. You can explain one person with porphyria, you can't explain the wish as the trigger, the iron as the ward, the specific targeting of isolated men in high places, all from a medical condition. That pattern is doing something else entirely. For me, human psychology is a much more interesting theory, and while yes, it technically doesn't explain how a creature like the Baobhan could exist, I think it explains why she existed. In the medieval Highlands, men died in the wilderness. They died from cold, from accidents, from other men. And when they died in ways that communities couldn't easily process or couldn't easily speak about, they needed a story. Not because they were naive, but because grief is hard to process. It's not like they had therapists back then. A story fills this role. A story tells you what happened, how to protect yourself, and what rules to follow so you don't end up the same way. When Alasdair and his friends went into the hills, only one came back. The community looked to Alasdair to explain what happened. How does a traumatized man explain that he doesn't know? That he'd been drinking and the events are blurry? Or, to take a more sinister view, how does a community reconcile with the idea that one of their own caused the death of the others? The answer is they don't have to. The Baobhan fills that gap. She is, in this reading, the shape of the real violence that was poured into. The creature that wears the face of what actually happened and makes it speakable. I'm not saying, oh, she wasn't real, who cares? I'm saying these people who created her managed to create something that allowed people to process grief, to process the fact that they'll never truly know what happened, that justice, in cases of murder, will never be served. The people who created the Baobhan, the people who told her story, they did something special. They gave the community a way to heal, a way to live. But while the story gave people a tool to process grief and loss, there's one thing I want you to consider, because it changes how you read the whole story. Darkness. Isolation. Imagine how dark it was when our hunters were in the glen and how little light their fire was providing. I have some reference to just how dark it would be. I've gone to the Highlands to see the aurora in the winter. It was unsettling. With the car headlights off, we couldn't see anything. Not the steep drop that was 5 feet from us, not each other. The flashlights on our phones did nothing, which to me signals that the campfire that Alasdair had was more for comfort than anything else. We had modern equipment, and the howling of the wind still made us jump and run back to the car. And the research backs up what we experienced. We know from modern research what real sustained darkness does to the human brain. Complete darkness, the kind that you only find far from any settlement on a cloudy Highland night, triggers genuine changes in perception. The brain starts generating input to fill the gap. Shapes that aren't there, sounds without sources. The longer you stay in it, the more convincing those perceptions become. Now add this to the darkness. 4 men who have been hunting all day, exhausted, cold, and a dying fire in an enclosed hollow where the oxygen drops slowly without you noticing. Oh yeah, and they were drinking. That combination produces exactly that kind of vivid, hyper-real experience that doesn't even feel like a hallucination. It feels completely, utterly true. So is that what happened to Alasdair's companions? Probably. But a hallucination doesn't stop at the iron horseshoe. A fever dream doesn't care what metal is on your horse. The story is specific. The women stopped at the iron, not at dawn, not at prayer, not at luck. They stopped at the practical object a prepared hunter would already have. But then again, hallucinations don't respond to logic. But they might conform to a story your grandmother told you when you were a boy. One story, 2 ideas. A story to explain grief and loss, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, Alasdair saw the Banshee because he'd been hearing the story since he was a boy. But if it's just a story, why has it survived for so long? Think about what the Banshee story is actually asking of you. Be prepared. Check your equipment before you go hunting, before you go somewhere help can't reach you. And don't say your desires out loud into the dark. The last one's interesting because wolves don't care what you want. The cold doesn't care. A bear has no opinion on your wishes. So why does a story about a lethal supernatural predator hinge specifically on a man saying a wish out loud? You already know the answer. You've been saying a version of it your whole life. Don't say your birthday wish out loud or it won't come true. Be careful what you put into the universe. You've heard these. You've probably said them. And there's a chance you've meant at least some of it. What we're doing when we say those things is the same belief those hunters were living inside. That desire, spoken out loud in the wrong place at the wrong time, draws something to you. In the 21st century, we call it manifestation, the law of attraction. The Highland Scots of the 17th century called it the Banshee. And it's a belief that transcends borders. I didn't suddenly learn these sayings when I came to Scotland. I learned them back home, back in Pennsylvania. Now, there's something about the Banshee that's worth sitting with, even if it's a bit uncomfortable. She's always female, always beautiful, always predatory, always targeting men who let desire make decisions for them. You could look at that pattern and see a very old suspicion of women dressed up in folklore clothing. And you'd be partly right, but it's not the whole story. The Banshee isn't the woman who punishes men for existing. She's the thing that answers when you're careless enough to invite it. The men in the story don't get targeted because they are walking through the Highlands. They get targeted because they spoke their want into the night without thinking about what the night contained. The lesson isn't women are dangerous. The lesson is what you desire can destroy you if you stop paying attention. That's a different lesson. And it's one that a community under the conditions the Highland imposed, cold, isolated, constantly negotiating with a landscape, and a political situation where both trying to reduce them, would have found genuinely useful. What does a story like this actually do for those people? It gives them rules. Not, the wilderness is random and you might die and there's no pattern to any of it. That's true. It's just not livable. You can't function inside that truth and keep going back out there. Instead, there are specific things that will protect you. Iron, silence about your desires, the right equipment. Follow the rules and you can survive. The story takes the formless terror of the Highland wilderness and gives it a shape. A shape has rules. Rules can be followed. The people passing this story down were not naive. They were people who found a way to survive a landscape that was actively trying to kill them. That gave them enough comfort to go back out there where their friends and family had died. The stories gave them rules to follow, rules they believed would save their lives. She's out of the hills now. A murder of crows or 5 musicians from Fife. Not the Highlands, not even close. Which makes it interesting that they reached for a Highland creature for their 2025 single. The track is gritty and direct. The hunter's tale set to something harder edged than a ballad. They didn't soften her, they didn't make her romantic or safe, they kept her sharp. That instinct to keep her dangerous, to not make her comfortable, says something. It says that the people still telling the story understand what it was for. Not horror, not just entertainment. But the same thing it was always for. To name the thing that lives in the place where your judgment fails you. The Highlands are still there, the dark is still there. The conditions that made the Banshee necessary haven't entirely gone, they've just changed shape. I wonder sometimes what Alasdair made of that long ride back through the dark. Whether he thought about the wish, whether he spent weeks after asking himself how differently that night could have gone if Ewan had just kept his mouth shut. He survived on a protection he didn't know he had, iron shoes that his horse wore. The thing that saved him wasn't magic, it was preparation. What do we call the thing that answers you when you say the wrong thing in the wrong place to the wrong kind of darkness? The Highlanders had a name for it. They called her the Banshee. She wore a white dress, and she was beautiful, and she danced with you until she didn't. I want to know 2 things from you. Do you think the Banshee is a warning about desire or a warning about carelessness? Those 2 readings can lead somewhere quite different, and I genuinely can't decide which one the original storytellers intended. And the tradition says iron stops her, but Alasdair didn't know his horse was freshly shod when he ran for it. He survived on a protection he didn't know he had. Is that luck, or is that tradition telling us something else entirely? Drop your answers in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land. If you enjoyed this journey into the folklore of the Scottish Highlands, please like the video. It really does help the channel more than you might think. And if you want more stories like this from the strange edges of Celtic tradition and the folklore history almost forgot, subscribe. We'll be here, somewhere between myth and memory. As always, history remembers, but folklore never forgets.